Good afternoon. Welcome to UCSF Medical Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter. I'm chair of the Department of Medicine at UCSF. Welcome to our live audience, now up to 200 or 300 people. Our other colleagues at UCSF, our friends at our partner sites at UCSF Health Network. As is our tradition, we will post this video tonight on YouTube. And the videos that we've done in this series so far now have more than a quarter of a million views. That will be about 7 o'clock p.m. and I will tweet that when it's up. A few ground rules for the live audience are shown here on the screen. Put the Zoom window in full screen mode and then fit to window. If you have questions, type them in the Q&A box. Probably won't be able to get to all of them, but my colleague Quinny Cheng will be screening them and pitch me the most commonly asked or most interesting questions. I've been planning these conferences now for about 3 months, and the way I do it is every weekend I sit down and ask myself, what are the most important things that are going on in COVID, new research findings, updates in the course of the disease, emerging evidence on things like testing or vaccines, impact on different patient populations. Then I find one of my colleagues who can speak to the issue and teach me, and hopefully all of you as well. This weekend was a little different. As I sat down to think about that, it sounded and felt too narrow. With the state of the universe being a pandemic that now has killed more than 100,000 Americans and soon 400,000 people in the world, an economy in free fall, a dysfunctional political system, and now a deeply troubling series of violent deaths associated with people's race and the protests that have followed. I realized that I did not really want to talk about a narrow issue in COVID, as important as those remain, and we will get back to them, but rather I wanted to talk about the state of our healthcare system, the state of the country, the state of the world. And so I asked myself if I could find 4 friends who could provide wisdom and insight, who could help make sense of this unique and terribly sad moment, who would they be? And so I asked for friends who are really my dream team, and remarkably, all 4 of them said yes, and that makes me incredibly excited about today's session. There will be no slides and no lectures. The format will be a chat. All 5 of us will be on for the same time, for the entire time. I trust that and hope that it will be provocative, illuminating, challenging, and if we're lucky, though I'm not sure how they will pull this off, a little bit hopeful. The 4 speakers, and they will come on in a second. The first is Desmond-Hellmann, most well known for being a former UCSF resident and my chief resident, but she went on to a few other gigs that were okay. She led product development at Genentech, then became the 9th Chancellor at UCSF, and then became the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a role she held until last year. Welcome, Sue. The next is Morrison, who is author, consultant, healthcare futurist, and past president of the Institute for the Future. Ian is a founding partner in Strategic Health Perspectives, a joint venture between Harris Interactive and the Harvard School of Public Health's Department of Health Policy and Management. Ian is a go-to person for everybody in the healthcare industry to figure out what the hell is going on and where we're going. So that's why I thought he was particularly important to have today. The next is Mark Smith. Mark also, his main claim to fame is he was a resident with me at UCSF a long time ago when Sue was our chief resident. But he went on to do a few other things, including becoming executive vice president of the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation, and ultimately the founding president and CEO of the California Healthcare Foundation. He continues as an active clinician and sees HIV patients at Zuckerberg San Francisco General to this day. Last but very much not least, my friend Abraham Verghese, who is Senior Associate Chair of the Department of Medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. I think everybody knows Abraham. He is the author of the best-selling book, Cutting for Stone, which if you haven't read, you need to do that this afternoon, and several other wonderful books. He's a noted humanist and perhaps the leading voice for preserving the human touch in medicine in an increasingly technological age. In 2016, he received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama for helping to deepen the nation's understanding of human experience. The whole session is going to go for 75-ish up to 90 minutes, or until we've solved the world's problems, whichever comes first. So with that, let me get started with Mark. And just to be very real, I'd love to hear, Mark, how you're thinking and how you're feeling as a Black man in America, and maybe as particularly as the father of a spectacular young Black man in America. What's going through your mind and your heart?
Well, let's start with the hopeful part. I actually am hopeful in part because of the depth and breadth of the reaction to this culminating incident, an incident that culminated a series of incidents over the last several weeks. So to see how many people from all walks of life in all 50 states and actually all over the world reacted to this gives me hope that people care. Everybody from the people that sell me sneakers to the people that wash my car now want to talk about institutional structural racism, which I think is a step forward. At the same time, I recognize there is a pandemic going on. And I worry about those protesters. I worry about my nieces and nephew who are out there. And I remember having seen in the last several days, several people talking about the talks that I had to have with my son that every parent of a Black or brown boy has to have about how they react in different situations to keep them safe. And one need only review the litany of the past several incidents that we've seen over and over again to understand why that discussion has to be held. So I am hopeful, and yet there's also a little bit of ominous edge around the mood of the country now that I think we need to talk about as well. So that's kind of where I am.
Great, thank you. Abraham, I'll ask you the same question. You've written about the immigrant experience and being the other in your first book, My Own Country. It was an incredibly poignant story about that and moving into the South in the early days of AIDS. So talk about how it feels from your perspective.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for having me as part of this. I must say, I'm witnessing this and watching the story unfold. You know, the story that began several months ago, and it's far from reached its climax. And then the immediate story of the last few days, which again is not an immediate story. It's been going on for a long, long time. It didn't begin with George Floyd. It began in 1619, you could say. And I think we're all trying to weave one narrative out of this to try and find one story and also to find our own personal narratives within this. And I think we're all struggling. I mean, I look at people, watching Netflix series obsessively and touting this book and that book. I think there's a great sense that we need instruction on how to digest these things that are coming at us so rapidly. And without the kind of leadership, I think that would help us, and reassure us. So I find myself thinking a lot about narrative, about, the shocking narratives we see on television, but also the increasing personal sense of what is my narrative. This is my third curfew in my lifetime. The first two were when I was a child in Africa. The difference was you woke up in the morning and there were bodies on the road to remind you what happened when you missed curfew. So it's a poignant time, in short.
Yeah, thank you. Sue, let me pivot a little bit toward COVID, and we'll go all over the place in the next hour or so. But it strikes me that you have a singular perspective. You ran the drug development process as one of the great biotech companies in the universe. You ran UCSF, one of the great academic research institutions in the universe, and you ran the Gates Foundation, which has had a huge focus on pandemics and thinking about infectious diseases. So how do you process all of that as you think about the pandemic? What makes you hopeful? What makes you fearful? How are you thinking about pandemics in the old days? And now that one is here, how does it feel?
So thanks, Bob, for having me. And by the way, I may have been your chief resident, but I was the second year resident for Mark Smith at San Francisco General, also a long time ago, which I will never forget. So the things that make me hopeful are in the innovation bucket. It is really striking to see more than 100 vaccines in development already. It is exciting to see what might happen with monoclonal antibodies. I think the drugs and the diagnostics are maybe a little bit further behind, but the capability of folks to innovate, and we are a little more ready. because of Ebola in 2014-15, some investments were made. And so I think that sharing, a lot more collaboration, a lot more open sourcing, with some of the downsides that come along with that, with early publication. But I'm really struck by the power of innovation in a very positive way. If there were two things that I would say have me more pessimistic, the tenets of public health, the thinking like an epidemiologist, ought to be more part of the public discourse. The absence of the CDC from the dialogue in the US during this pandemic, the absence of very clear public health messages that people could follow, and the rapid politicization of those public health messages have taken me by surprise. Because while we're waiting for the innovations, while we get what we need to protect people, we very much need simple public health measures to protect people. And I've been disappointed at both the leadership and at the level of understanding of the public. The other thing, and this really, I think, resonates for me this week even more than it did the last 3 months, this pandemic shows us that the inequities we talk about in our healthcare system they're not just shocking, they're deadly. And so as we think about race, as we think about African Americans and what it's like for an African American in America, yes, we should talk about everything that's happened in Minneapolis, but we need to talk, especially as healthcare providers, and I know at UCSF there's been a lot of efforts on this. We need to talk about people's experience of staying healthy and getting healthy.
Great, thank you. All right, Ian, an easy one. Tell us first what a futurist is, and then I'll get a follow-up question to that.
Well, I always say that my definition of a futurist is an economist who couldn't handle the calculus. I'm in the sweeping generalization business and have been for a very long time. And I'm the only person on this call who thought the Krebs cycle was a bicycle up until about 4 years ago. So I'm here to hold up the geography major's end of things. But
all right, now, and I assume that part of being a good futurist is you've got to be a good historian and understand how the lessons of the past play out in the future. So I guess it's sort of a dual-pronged question. How do you apply that now? And it feels like history is failing us a little bit. Maybe it's not. Maybe I just don't know it well enough. It feels like these multiple threads of pandemic meets economy, meets politicization of everything, meets the racial issues. I mean, are there precedents for that help you think through what the next 5 years might be like?
yeah, and I think that's right, Bob. I think there's a tradition in British universities. I'm an Edinburgh grad, but it's true of the Oxbridge experience too, of political economy is the way in which economics is taught. And it's the interweaving of history, politics, and economics. And I think we can learn from that. But I think what I've been obsessing with in this particular time is the kind of second order effects of this pandemic on the economy on the one hand, and how that is going to dictate the future, particularly given the massive government deficit we're running up and what that creates. And if I could tie it all together, the conversation so far in one story, I mean, as you know, I'm on the board of the Martin Luther King Hospital in LA, which Mark can speak to more eloquently than I in terms of the early experience. But this was a hospital that was born originally out of the rubble of the Watts riots and a service to an underserved community. It went horribly sideways for a whole bunch of reasons, both clinically and economically. It was closed and has been reopened. Actually, we're celebrating our 5th anniversary next month of reopening and been doing really well. And the thing, and partly because we're not in the elective surgery business per se, we have sort of weathered the COVID storm, despite the fact that almost half of our patients at the height were COVID patients. What's going to kill us potentially is the fact that we have special funding enabled through the state through an act of assembly, a state legislative action, which is under threat because of the budget. Governor Newsom is in a $54 billion hole. So we potentially could lose 10% of our revenue. And it sort of all connects, because the people who are going to be the first to be laid off are people of color who are in jobs, either in essential services or in retailing and so forth. And it just seems like a double whammy or triple whammy, whatever number of whammies you want, that the poorest folk are the people who are going to be hurt at the end of this, and that some of the better off parts of the country are going to be able to recover. So I think you have to draw on politics, economic, and history, and remind ourselves that the more things change, the more they don't.
So let me stick with you for a second as we pivot a little bit into the healthcare industry. There have been people out there that have said there's 10% waste in the healthcare system. There are people that say there's 40% waste in the healthcare system, and the incentives are all wrong. And whacking out 10% of everybody's budget would be a good thing, because they'll learn to be innovative and do the right thing. So tell us why it's not a good thing, or some of the challenges that we're going to face with this.
Well, I mean, 2 points. I think the first point is that one man's waste is another man's income, right? And there is sort of certainly damage to be done to that. But I wrote a thing recently, and Mark will remember, I had the honor of serving on Mark's board at California Healthcare Foundation, and I wrote a thing last week saying that COVID and high deductible healthcare are very similar in that they're a blunt instrument. They have probably taken out inappropriate care and appropriate care in equal measure, much in the way that high deductible healthcare did. And so, the problem with all of these shocks to the system is that, again, it would be beautiful. It's what I call the happy economist scenario. It'd be beautiful if lean times led to rationalization so that only the best of what we do is preserved. But I worry greatly that it will be a blunt instrument and we'll simply cut, both appropriate and inappropriate care.
And Mark, I've heard you speak many times about all the euphemisms we use about value and these lovely terms, and you often say, just make it cheaper, right?
CHEAPER, cheaper. That's what people want. All this bending the curve and the area under the curve, and people want it to be cheaper. Yeah, that's right.
All right.
But one of the interesting things is how quickly people have discovered telemedicine in the last 2 months. I interviewed Clayton Christensen many years ago, the kind of father of disruptive innovation. He talked about how far behind the rest of the service industries healthcare and higher education were. And it turns out that changes that people have been trying to get done for 20 years have happened in 30 days under duress. That's not to say that things won't go back again, but I think 4 years from now, every doctor will be a hybrid doctor. Every doctor will be practicing in part in person, in part by email, in part by telephone, and in part by video, to different dimensions from different specialties. But I think people have learned quite quickly. Here's where maybe one of the sharp parts of this blunt instrument has been. Both doctors and patients themselves have realized fairly quickly how much of their time and money was wasted on low-value stuff that had to do with moving people rather than data, moving humans rather than information. And I think we're never going to go back to some of the ways we were dealing with these services again. So that maybe is a bright lining if we can capture some of these gains in efficiency that people have been forced to adopt out of duress.
And just talk a little bit about what the lessons of that are. Telemedicine seems like such an obvious thing in certain ways. I'll turn to Abraham in a second to talk about maybe some of its downsides or challenges, but sort of a logical, obvious thing, and people were already out there Zooming and FaceTiming and all that, and yet it was not happening, or happening at snail's pace. So what did the fact that we did 5 years of innovation in a month tell us about the path of innovation in healthcare?
Well, I think it told us first that money, as usual, is always a culprit. To the extent that we get paid when people show up and don't get paid when we talk with them on the phone, we will construct a system in which people show up. Second, power is an issue. Bob's heard this from me before. We've constructed a system in which it's organized for our convenience and priorities rather than patients. And third, it's a question of inertia. In part, it's the way we do things because it's the way we've always done things and we feel comfortable doing that way. We couldn't do it anymore. A lot of the regulations and restrictions on telemedicine, which were barriers, had to be removed because it was evident that we couldn't do things the old way. And I think one of the big lessons for the future will be our studying which of those things come back and which of those things remain as reduced barriers. That will be one of the big questions. And of course, some of that depends on whether or not we see a second or a third or a fourth wave, whether or not the vaccine about which Sue was talking that we're all hopeful about actually gets here relatively soon. So I think it remains to be seen, but I think that is a lesson.
Great. So Abraham, I want to turn to you. You know, when people talk about what the durable impact of all of this will be on the healthcare system, telemedicine seems like it's answers 1 through 5. So first of all, do you think that's right? And second of all, as probably the leading proponent in the universe of the importance of the human touch, how do you process this movement toward telemedicine?
Well, Bob, I mean, I'm fascinated to see how quickly we developed it, as Mark just said. You know, overnight, we suddenly were doing hundreds of visits, and I think it's absolutely the thing for the moment. I also think it's been precious. This is the first chance I've had to look into a patient's home and actually see family members go by. Now, we're actually very excited and working on the concept of what we call the home clinic. I mean, because I think we can be a lot more sophisticated than sitting at the screen and chatting with them. I mean, there are already people doing, you know, things like taking their temperature and little videos of their throat, but also, you know, listening to their hearts and stethoscopes. I mean, perhaps one day we'll have a box that we deliver when you sign on to your healthcare program or mine, and that'll have us be much more sophisticated about the home. I also think that, you know, it's great for us to see them in the home, get out there ourselves. Maybe this will lead to home visits. So I'm all for it. I think people assume that I'll be against it just because they also assume that you and I are mortal enemies because they see you as the digital guy and I'm this touchy-feely guy. Tries to find that we're actually friends. So I think it's a wonderful trend. I think we'll come back to some mix of it. We clearly didn't need to be bringing people back, you know, 10 days after surgery just to look at their wound.
You've emphasized so much the ritual of the human touch, the presence, the being there, and you know, I mean, telemedicine can't completely replicate that. Nor, or I guess I'd frame this. You've also worried, as I do, about sort of the death spiral of the physical exam. That we sort of instinctively, you know, we do not believe that you have an arrow through the head unless we get the CAT scan. And so are you worried about that and what it does for medical education, what it does for true presence?
I think the real downside of telemedicine for us, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is it's been really hard to teach effectively when you're doing telemedicine. So at some point, I think for the sake of education, if nothing else, it'd be great to get back to the clinic. I do think that, you know, obviously safety comes first, and so it'll be a while before we get there. I think the physical exam has been in great, you know, jeopardy well before this, as you know, and I've even gotten letters from people saying, I can do just as good an exam as when we were doing this live, and I'm thinking, really?
Maybe that's true because it was so bad.
I mean, effectively, a lot of exams are just sort of spot checks, and you know, maybe they can just be telemedicine. But I think we have tried with our presence team to take some of the elements of that in-person ritual and apply it to telemedicine. For example, you can still, you know, make your desk clean. Don't be distracted. Be sure you look in the camera. You know, there are some rituals that we can try and enact to make this visit as powerful as it can be, but it still feels like something's a bit lacking.
Yeah. And what's your sense when this is over? Right, I think most of us have pivoted from 2% telemedicine to 60 or 70. Do you think we end up at 50 or 20 or 30? Do you have any guesses about that?
Well, we're coming back, Bob. I don't know about you guys, but we certainly have a lot of telemedicine, but we're also getting a lot more clinic visits. There are just some situations where I think it is very hard to juggle everything, especially if the patient is having some struggle with communication, a family member is more involved, and they can't tell you what the patient's manifesting. So I think we're coming back to more, but I think there'll always be a very, very strong element of telemedicine going forward from here on.
I mean, certainly we have been surprised by the level of not only acceptance but fondness for it from both parties. That physicians who resisted it forever are now saying this is pretty great, and patients, our patient satisfaction measures are higher through telemedicine than they were in person, and part of that is schlepping over the bridge and parking and all that kind of stuff. You can see how it might be attractive to do it from home. Ian.
Yeah, well, but I really want to just set up maybe to bring Mark in on this, because he and I have had a number of conversations along this line, and I have been talking to some of the clinical leaders who are running innovation shops in various parts of the country in the health systems, and there seems to me to be a big fundamental question on telehealth is, are we simply going to do a substitution for visits, which is what we used to call at the Institute for the Future, paving the cow path? Or are we going to take this as an opportunity to transform clinical processes end to end? And I've sat in on, your Grand Rounds, Bob, and also Stanford, talking about, and other systems, talking about how they've changed workflows to incorporate. It's very much along the lines of Mark's hybrid practice. And I guess the question I would ask the experts here is that the future? Is it a transformation of clinical care to be much more digital in its mix? That's the right answer, versus maybe a naive notion of substitution of simple visits for video visits.
Yeah, well, I've made the point that, you hear people who are a little utopian about all this stuff say how wonderful it's going to be that not only can you do a televisit, but patients are going to have their watch and their sensors, and their toilet is going to have sensors for their urine electrolytes, and all that's going to get beamed to the primary care doctor, who's going to say, that's great. That's not a world that I'm familiar with. Primary care doctors will quit by 5 o'clock this afternoon if we begin doing that. So the infrastructure to make this all work goes far beyond just the substitution of one way of doing a visit to another. Mark, I think you wanted to weigh in.
So I wanted to make 2 points. One, I think the creation of a hybrid practice requires rethinking lots of how physicians practice, how they're managed, how they're evaluated, how they're compensated. If we can offload low-value visits to non-physical means, you can see people more frequently or for longer for the ones who do need physical means. But then whoever is the physician in chief or the administrator needs to rethink what their definition of productivity is. How many patients are you expected to see? How do you organize the physician's day? How do you integrate telephone or email conversations into documentation and payment and evaluation? So I think it's not as easy as it sounds, just convert visits to visits. The second thing is I would posit, as Abraham said, there's a lot that is lost in the human touch. But physicians are not the only valuable human touchers. And so often there are circumstances where nurses, LVNs, medical assistants, psychologists, pharmacists, and others are the human touch that's most necessary. Part of the future of technology that I see is that the notion of a home visit need not be the physician going to someone's house. You can send a nurse or a high school graduate with the right technology who can have human touch, and the person across town can listen and see if they hear that S3, or use the handheld ultrasound to see if there's a sightings there, and not necessarily eliminate human touch. So I think if we get out of the notion that telemedicine is just a substitute for a physical visit with a video visit, and think expansively in a world where we can recreate business models and the ways in which teams operate, there's really unlimited potential about redesigning healthcare in a way that's both more efficient, more effective, and of higher quality.
And are you hopeful about that, or is that too much change to count on from us without major changes in incentives?
Well, I am hopeful. As you know, I've spent a lot of the last few years working on value-based payment. My sense is that in the end, not magically or inexorably, but in the end, this experience will accelerate the notion of value-based payment, because those physicians and groups and others who have been opposed to it in the past, holding on to the old thing, are now going to have to get paid for those video visits and emails and phone visits. And so I think the notion, the realization that in reality they are not going back to the volume of inpatient visits that they had before, but are trying to retrieve the income that they had before, becomes kind of a tailwind for, well, let's think about how we get paid a little more differently here. So I am optimistic.
Yeah.
There's nothing automatic about it, but I'm optimistic.
Right. Sue, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, a couple points on this. One, nobody's mentioned something about telemedicine that I've heard a lot in businesses that I interact with, and that is, it's one thing to use Zoom to interact with people on an intact team and folks who already know each other. It's far different to say, okay, this is a new hire. They never met anybody, and they're going to meet them all digitally. If you have a patient who you've been seeing for a long time, having a televisit with an existing patient, I think, is a far different enterprise than somebody who's got an acute condition or who's a new patient visit. So I don't think that we can extrapolate from one to the other after 3 months in to what we're doing. The one thing that I think is struck me so much in the last 5.5 years at Gates Foundation that we never talk about here is, what are the nations, what are the state, the nation, the community's priorities for health? Because those should drive how the visits get done. The value-based should be value, because these are conditions that everyone struggles with. So Tedros, who's the head of WHO now, the first time I ever met him, he was the Minister of Health in Ethiopia. And he told me 2 things that made me wish that we had these in the US. One is, here's my top 10 things that we're going to fix in Ethiopia. If you're not on my top 10 list, you're going to have to convince me why I spend money on it. And secondly, I've got frontline healthcare providers who have minimum training and who have just enough education and compensation to get things done, like vaccinations, like well baby visits. And so we don't think that way. We don't think about cost effectiveness and maximizing the time of that internist, surgeon, nurse. And as Mark just said, I think as we look at where we go post-pandemic, not only have we seen a lot of visits, we've seen a lot of people not count on the medical system. That means they, drive up to Parnassus or Mission Bay and spend a lot of money to park.
Yeah. Let me just say, to sort of follow that up with you, something I've said to people as they think about healthcare being transformed by digital, and it's our turn to get turned upside down, is you don't understand that doctors are better lobbyists than taxi cab drivers. and so, I mean, you ran this place for a while, and you can say, well, we want the world to change to those 10 priorities. But then I'm guessing when you were sitting in your seat being chancellor, you said, but our priority is to make sure the machine continues. And that means we're doing all the neurosurgeries and all the transplants, even if those aren't on that top 10 list, because it's the top 10 list is vaccines and social determinants and all those. So how does the 2 parts of your brain sort of process that?
So for me, I don't think you can or should blow up the existing medical system. I think that first of all wouldn't work, but I do think the how I process it is what I know everybody wants. Everybody wants people to be healthy. I mean, I buy into that, and so I think there are tools that one can use with existing infrastructure to drive more productive outcomes. And so part of what I actually think UCSF or Stanford in and of themselves are less an impediment than the number of doctors who go into expensive specialties. I think that is a potential impediment if you say we just don't need that many, surgeries of this or interventions on that, because I think that if you don't drive medicine that way, humans do what they're incented to do. If you pay differently, people go where the money is. They go where their skills take them, they go where the money is. So I think it's the one thing that I found at UCSF and at Genentech less so at Gates Foundation because we didn't have that much money, but the money matters. If you want to see where things go, if you want to see what labs people order, what surgeries they do, the money matters.
Yeah, sure does. Abraham, I think you had your hand up, and I'd love to, as you're speaking to this, but the question came in, the issue of the intersection between class and race and the economics of telemedicine, sort of a la the digital divide. Does it make it better? Does it make it worse? So say what you wanted to say, but maybe if you could address that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say was very much related to that. I think the few telemedicine visits that I've had a chance to sit in on has made me appreciate how much we just give lip service to things like social determinants of health, and how little we have ever taken the time to really study someone in their environment, have any sense of the family, as I call it, the friends and family, and what kind of support system they have, the chaos in their living room, which is where they're doing this. And it made me recognize how much we sitting in our offices, summoning the patient to our clinics, take for granted. And I think it leads to your next question about the digital economic divide.
Yeah. Yeah. Mark, do you want to sort of think a little bit about that issue of sort of social determinants generally, and then will telemedicine help it or hurt it?
So I think it helps. Ian mentioned our colleague Elaine Batchelor, who is the CEO of Martin Luther King Hospital in Los Angeles. I was in a meeting with her, a Zoom meeting a couple of weeks ago, and she mentioned they, of course, like everyone else, have pivoted to digital visits. They found that a number of their patients preferred phone visits rather than video visits. Not necessarily because they didn't have the equipment, but because they were embarrassed about or not quite comfortable with people seeing their homes for whatever reason. So again, there's no one single answer. That's why every doctor is going to have 4 channels, not 1, not 2, but 4. And I think we're underestimating the power of markets here to press. As Sue said, the system follows the money. My family we use Kaiser Permanente for our healthcare. For several years now, I've been able to email my doctor at Kaiser, take a picture of a skin lesion, send it, get an answer back, send a text and get a prescription done. And you've seen now that Kaiser's competitors in the market now have to adopt that same capability, because once you've been able to access care like that, you are not going back to a world in which you have to drive across town. So in this world, I think part of what will drive the adoption of telemedicine is convenience and affordability driven by patients. Because if I'm going to have a procedure done and my surgeon's saying I have to come into the office 3 times ahead of surgery, have the surgery, come into the office 3 times afterwards, and my next door neighbor said, I did all that stuff online ahead of time. I came home and we did it by email. I'm going there. So I think the market reality of its increased convenience for patients will drive the providers to the extent that there is choice available in the system around these sorts of things.
Great. Ian.
Well, just a couple of quick points on this thread. One is that the ubiquitous technology is the cell phone, right? And it was originally, text messaging being the default across almost all socioeconomic groups. But I think with the cheapness of smartphones, that's also true. And I think it speaks to Mark's point about that being the platform more than perhaps video enabled, or although it could be a video enabled on your smartphone, obviously, but rather than fancier gear. The other point is tying back to what Sue said about leadership and the alignment of incentives. And I'm impressed at a number of systems, and I'm thinking about people like Jefferson and Philadelphia and Providence and Seattle. They're leaders basically who are sort of embarking on major digital transformations, are exhorting their colleagues to behave as if they're capitated when they're not, right? That you can somehow cover the cracks, because I think, as Sue points out, if the incentives are too blatant for a volume-based system, then it's very hard to get people to change. But if you can cover the cracks and say, do the right thing, and we'll make up the difference somewhere else, that's an encouraging sign of how you.
Let me ask you about that, because the early part of this conversation, we're even hearing myself say we're trying to get patients back in, and I could see the look in Mark's face. Say, there you are, there you go again. Just all about the volume and all that. So we could exhort people to say, do the right thing, if the right thing is to keep people healthy and out of the hospital and invest in social determinants, that's what we should do. In March, we were losing $5 million a day. And we could survive that for a month or two, but not a year. We will actually go under. And so you can only exhort so much if you really don't have the capital to paper over the fact that the economic incentives are driving you in the wrong direction. So how do you navigate that sort of dichotomy?
It's getting, it's getting harder, and I hope we can explore a little bit about what the financial, this exposes to me, COVID has exposed the financial hydraulics of American healthcare, right? The way the game works is elective procedures in the main, generally of a surgical nature or diagnostic nature, getting prices that are 200 or 300 or 400% of what the cost is, right? As a mechanism to pay for a lot of good stuff. I'm not saying there isn't good stuff being done. That is the game that is being played, right? And I think to your point, Bob, that game has come under big pressure because of all, I've been saying that January 2020 will be the all-time American high in private employer-sponsored coverage for the next decade. And that from here on out, I can't envisage a scenario where the relative payer mix is going to move towards public payment for a whole bunch of reasons. And that's the challenge institutions have, is they're going to have to do this with less rather than have the luxury of surplus from the old fee-for-service system.
So let me ask you a question about consolidation as well. So, there was a trend already ongoing of big systems gobbling up smaller places and it being more difficult for a 100-bed hospital to make it and a 1-2-person physician office to make it. And how does the trend here, telemedicine and economic struggles being maybe the two dominant ones, change that curve? I mean, you can imagine telemedicine creating an environment where a UCSF or a Stanford can take care of patients anywhere in the world, and people don't have to get here to do that. And so you could imagine it would enable far more consolidation, for better or worse.
Well, I defer to all of my colleagues here on the physician side, but certainly what I'm hearing is deep concern that because of the devastation on primary care practices, if they're not aligned with larger systems, that those physicians become vulnerable to being swept up by either large systems or private equity. And the purchasers up the food chain are very concerned about that as being a negative effect. And I do think we're probably going to see consolidation generally in the industry as weaker players capitulate, because as you say, Bob, you can't go on losing $5 million a day forever, right?
Yeah. Any other thoughts about that and sort of the impact of what's going on with consolidation, Abraham?
I would just push back a little bit and say I worry that the big systems that have been so dependent on private insurance are actually more at risk in many ways, perhaps, than the small practice in a town that was so used to surviving on, a bit of Medicare, Medicaid. We basically, I think, speaking for ourselves, I think this is accurate. We lose money on the Medicare, Medicaid patients. I don't think we make money. So if the whole mix moves to more and more of that, I would worry that the big systems are the ones going to be in jeopardy.
Yeah. Mark, did you have something to add?
I think it'll vary market by market. I think there certainly will be a phenomenon of the big get bigger. The people with good balance sheets and endowments can weather a storm. And the hospitals that are more marginal will find themselves squeezed and looking for shelter. In the doctor world, a lot of practices have already been aggregated. I think before COVID hit, there was this phenomenon of growing value-based payment on the one hand and growing interest in companies. We could name Alidata as one, there are others, that were helping practices reorganize their workflow and their economics to take advantage of that movement towards value-based care. Whether or not that dual momentum, both on the payment side and the reorganization side, can resume when the worst of the pandemic is over, I think remains to be seen. But right now we're in this strange position where health plans are flush with cash because nobody's been filing claims. And a lot of them have, either voluntarily or under some pressure, basically been advancing money to primary care practices precisely to try to keep them from going under. Because as Ian said, they haven't. So whether or not that can happen as practices begin to reopen and they can weather the storm, if that can happen, I think, again, I would hold out some hope for both the government and private payers moving more towards value-based care, and there being various actors in the market who can facilitate fee-for-service practices navigating that transition, which is the thing that always has stopped us.
So the questions come up in the chat here, the obvious question, which is nobody has said the word single payer yet. And, we've talked about the kind of screwy incentive systems that you make money out of this and you use it to cross-subsidize that, and the linkage of insurance to employment, which is pretty tricky when you've got tens of millions of newly unemployed people. So can any of you sort of give me what you thought the probability of single payer was 4 months ago over, let's say, the next 3 years, and what you think it is today?
Well, the way we futurists hedge that question is it depends. I think there are a number of scenarios. Let me give you sort of two data points. One is that I think what this does is call a bluff on tying health insurance to employment, right? I mean, it seems like that's a fine and dandy idea when the unemployment rate is 3.7%. It's a less fine and dandy idea when it's 20% unemployment. So I think that there'll be a broader questioning of the vulnerability of that going forward. But here's the other partial evidence. The states who were pushing in that direction, like Colorado with a public option, withdrew that public option in the last 30 or 40 days, largely because the way it was going to be financed was effectively a price controls on hospitals, on the very hydraulics that we were talking about. So, Mark and I have been working on these sort of cartoonish scenarios, but you can imagine a scenario in which the flesh is willing, or whatever the line is. I mean, basically, we'd love to do single payer. We just don't. We have a $4 trillion deficit. Yeah. And even Bernie can't come up with $10 trillion. I mean,
All right. Anybody else want to comment on sort of the prospects?
I would have said 25%.
Before or now?
Before.
Yeah.
And now I'd go up to still less than 50, but maybe 40, 45%. And the one thing nobody mentioned in the dialogue about where we go with hospitals is 6 months from now, there's an election.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
At 5 million a day, I don't want to wait 6 months to know the answer.
Right.
But I don't think it has to be single payer or Medicare for all. But depending on the outcome of the presidency, I think it has a massive impact on this question.
In what way? So what's politically feasible? Let's say Biden wins and the country moves a little bit left. What is possible and maybe that was not possible 4 months ago?
I think it would be Obamacare with, a nudge.
Yeah.
I don't think it'd be more than that.
Okay. Mark,
so I think if you're asking 5 years from now, I think the probability of universal coverage is probably much higher now. Single payer, I almost hesitate because everybody means something different. Ian has heard me say before, for the last 20 years, there are really extreme single payer people on the one hand and really extreme market forces people on the other hand. And for the last 20 years, we've moved back and forth in this relatively narrow range in the middle. Romney care, Obamacare, even Republican proposals are kind of in here. And I've said before, I thought the way we would actually break through that and get some sort of system that actually guaranteed universal coverage was either really good news, like effective treatment for Alzheimer's that people can't get if they don't have coverage, a cure for multiple myeloma, or really bad news. And my notion of really bad news was another 9/11, but this is probably as bad a news as we're going to get, hopefully, in a while. My sense is, in the next few years, the notion that somehow people should be left on their own to cope with the vagaries of life, and if they don't have insurance, well, just tough luck. I think that notion is dead.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that will lead to people rising up and say, no more VA, no more retiree health care, no more Kaiser Permanente, all the insurance companies are banned? I don't, but I think there's a very good chance that this will reopen and really accelerate the discussion of there's got to be a way that our country can organize itself to make sure that everybody has coverage.
Great. Go ahead, Ian, and then I
Well,
want
I just
to
want to do a shout out for Sue's point about Obamacare with a nudge, and I think we haven't talked about it much, but is Medicaid as a platform going forward. Most of the sensible forecasts of the effect of employment changes post-COVID would have commercial insurance falling by 20 million or so, and Medicaid rolls rising by up to 20 million over the next year. And so I think we can't lose sight that Medicaid is a crucial part of the story in the interim, notwithstanding the move towards single payer. Although I was joking with a group this morning saying the good news is we're going to have a single payer system. The bad news is it's United Healthcare.
Let me pivot slightly to the sort of drug development and the process of science and what has changed and what have we learned. Maybe this is best for you, Sue, to start with. One of the things that has changed in the last 3 months is studies coming out in 2 months rather than 2 years, coming out in preprints rather than peer-reviewed journals, coming out on Twitter, coming out in press releases, the FDA sort of changing its the way it thinks about things to sort of shift towards speed and maybe away from safety. You think that's good, bad, and where do you think it leaves us when all this is over? Hopefully it will be at some point.
I think it's mostly bad. And I'm surprised to hear me say that.
Yeah.
But one of the most important assets that a product developer has is confidence. And when I was at Genentech, it was just be sure of it. Be sure about safety. Be sure about this. And not uncommonly, we would need more time or more patience to have more confidence. And so what I think is the downside to the speed that's going on now, and you see it, you like me follow Twitter. It's the Wild West. And I'm not talking about like crazy Twitter. I'm talking about Eric Topol Twitter. And there's a difference. Yeah. The papers are coming out so fast. People are having to change things. The latest is on the hydroxychloroquine study. And so you do not want to have a bunch of retractions. So I'm pretty negative about the early publication when people haven't seen source data or just going too fast. In product development, unlike publication, I think you can go very, very fast, but you have to have a clear asterisk. So it's not uncommon in oncology and cancer medicine. You say, I'm getting an accelerated approval, and people who are very sick and going to die of cancer can get this medicine while in parallel we do a trial. If that trial is negative, the drug's gone, because that asterisk is on there. If you said, okay, so remdesivir I think was done well. It was out for compassionate use. They needed data in order to have it approved. And so I think there are ways with products you can do that. Here's what I don't know how to do. I don't know how to do a vaccine approval for an accelerated approval if 330 million people are going to get it. Yeah. So now I could make a case that you could do vaccine, and as either you just do because there's so much money, you have so many patients that you have a big safety database and you feel good about it, or you have a small safety database and you go to a small groups of individuals who are at particularly high risk until you build your safety database. But for me, the two things are confidence, number one, because once you group up on confidence, it's over. Yeah. And I think that's hurt us on masks, by the way. Just the public health description of masks. But the second thing is just clarity of communication. If this is an accelerated approval, if it's conditional, if it's we're not sure yet, tell people you're not sure yet. People can cope with that. But this aura of confidence when you're not confident makes me very, very concerned, especially with vaccines. I think with vaccines, it has to be safe and effective unless you're really clear about who you give the vaccine and that those people know how much you know about it.
Yeah, but I was talking about our $5 million a day. You talk about whatever billions of dollars a day the economy is hurting because we can't open up. You see sort of the competitive pressure to move things along faster than you normally would.
And look, I think it's great that they're going as fast as they are. This vaccine speed is truly unprecedented, and not being done sloppy, not being done bad. But when it's ready for approval, just think, okay, so you're in charge of the vaccine program. You start phase 3 in July. You go till December. You have 6 months worth of data, and the ramp up of patients in the trial. And in January, you're going to treat 200 million patients with your vaccine.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure you know enough.
Probably. Yeah. I was surprised a little bit to hear Fauci talk through the vaccine trials and no discussion of this idea of intentionally infecting people, which of course is incredibly interesting, incredibly dicey. If it's 6 months versus we could figure it out in 2 weeks if a bunch of 25-year-olds were willing to have coronavirus blown up their nose.
Well, here's the thing. So I think this is, for most product developers, this is binary. If you had a cure for COVID-19, have at it. Have a human challenge model.
Yeah.
If you don't have a cure, if you're 25, if you're 40, if you're 15, I'm not going to challenge somebody where I don't have a remedy for what I'm challenging them with. So there's a human challenge model for malaria, but we have drugs for malaria. Mm-hmm. I think that my own belief is the enthusiasm for human challenge kind of went up and then it went away. And it may be because of that, because there's just no cure.
Yeah, I'm sure it is, but it is an interesting sort of ethical conundrum, because you could argue if it shortens the time to getting an effective vaccine out by 3 months, and the probability of that 25-year-old getting really sick is very, very, very low, non-zero. And maybe you pay him or her a few bucks for their risk.
No, you could make the argument, and you could pay them and make sure they really volunteered and all of that. Yeah. I don't think. Let me be clear. I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's crazy at all, and I understand why people are avoiding it.
Yeah, got it. Mark, you had something to add?
No.
Abraham, you've thought a lot about ethics and all that. Anything you want to say about this, or what you're seeing about the drug development process and and in some ways the risk that I think you've always been a proponent to some extent of slow medicine, of being thoughtful and being careful in everything we do. How do you think we're getting the balance right now?
Oh, I absolutely see the need to be quick. And I think we're full of ethical dilemmas with COVID. How do we ration ventilator use? How do we justify hospital A sitting there with 3 ventilators when hospital B is drowning? I mean, it's been an ethicist delight is not the word, but it's certainly kept busy thinking about all these issues. And overlying all that, I keep coming back to this horrible scene we witnessed in Minneapolis. That keeps echoing underneath all this as the biggest ethical dilemma of all, that we have basically lived with a 2-tier society and managed to somehow allow it to go on until it reached this flashpoint. And I think that was really, I feel ashamed about it, to be honest.
Yeah. And you say until we've reached this flashpoint, and then it just strikes me, okay, now people are paying attention. Will anything fundamental change? These are really, really hard problems. We're going to move to the end in maybe the next 5 or 10 minutes, but love to hear your thoughts about whether you are hopeful that you think there will be fundamental change, or we'll talk a lot and not change all that much.
Are you asking me, Bob?
Yeah.
I want to come back to narrative. I actually think that this is the moment of change. Narratives are so important to us. And if you think about the genesis of the National Health Service in England, it was born because of a novel, The Citadel, that captured public's attention, and of this little coal mining town, I think in Wales. And the conditions were such, the public was just so caught up with that there was a sentiment saying we can change. What ended slavery in America? I would argue it wasn't a president, it wasn't soldiers or political scientists. It was one novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that captured the public's imagination. I think this, blood-curdling scene of someone dying under your eyes, millions of people watching, is the trigger. And we have to change. We as leaders, I think, must engineer that change. We cannot just, this is the only thing I think we can be talking about, is how do we correct this?
Yeah, it just strikes me though, as you go through those examples, we now have a country that sort of reads two different narratives or sees two different sets of realities. And the question is, can you imagine something that unifies people toward a common end in this current political environment?
Well, I'm an optimist. I see people, slowly dawning to the sort of truth that they kept at bay. I also think that the great lesson of novels is that character is defined by decisions taken under pressure. It has been very revealing, even for those who are great fans of some of our leaders, to witness, this person that they supposedly admire make these really stupid decisions under pressure. And, I think it's hard for most people to reconcile that. And at a certain point, they break. You've seen that today with Mattis coming out and saying things fairly strongly, and you've seen that with the senator from Maine, I believe it is. So I'm an optimist. I think that this is the moment, and things are changing. But it's up to us to keep that momentum going. It's not just going to happen organically while we watch it on TV or follow it on Twitter.
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
So Bob, let me just maybe try to tie these two things together, at least in my mind. My sense is that some of the anger that you've seen, not just from Black people, but from all the people who've been participating in these protests, is informed by the widespread recognition about the disproportionate impact of COVID on people of color. And so I'm reminded of the fact that when this data first started coming out, and you hear someone say, well, why do you think Black people are more affected? And the kind of answer was, well, they have more pre-existing conditions of hypertension and diabetes. And there were two things that were wrong with that. The first thing was, no one asked, well, why is that? Is that some sort of genetic thing, or is that mediated by melanin, or why is that? And then the second thing is, we now recognize people's susceptibility to this virus has to do with where they live and what they do for a living, whether they drive the bus or work next to each other in a meatpacking plant, and which nursing home they're in, along with viral load and all sorts of other stuff. But it strikes me that in 1908, I think, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book called The Health and Physique of the Negro American, which was written to counter the explanation of the observation of the inferior health among Black people as being somehow innate inadequacy of their biology. And this notion of social determinants is not a new thing by any means. I do think the severity of its manifestations being uncovered by the COVID pandemic, coupled with the visibility and starkness of these inequalities in other areas of life, do come together to kind of reinforce this notion, as Abraham said, that perhaps with my hopeful side, people do begin to get it, how these things are connected.
I hate to be the skunk in the room. I'm going to push back slightly on because when I hear about social determinants, the next step, which is sort of logical, is okay, UCSF, okay, Stanford, you should be out there helping to fix poverty, the educational system, housing. I mean, we can't even really run a healthcare system all that well. Yeah. So who will do this, and how does this new narrative and the pressure, how does it result in meaningful change? Because I'm not convinced the healthcare system is the right agent to do it or is capable of doing it.
I agree with you. I think the healthcare system can play a role. I think there are aspects of financing that can help incent. They're playing the appropriate role. I will urge to all of your listeners and viewers to read a blog that Alan Weil, the editor-in-chief of Health Affairs, published yesterday on this issue, which points out that it's all very well and good for a hospital with billions of dollars in endowments to pay for a little food for some of its patients, but one should not ignore the vast economic and power relationships that underlie these sorts of circumstances. So it's not going to happen by its own. Certainly doesn't happen inexorably. To the extent that we help payment systems that bring visibility to and even a little bit accountability for these larger social issues to people who have resources in healthcare, I think it's helpful. But I think we've got to always worry about our own arrogance and hubris and be realistic about the impact of the economics that are involved.
Yeah, and arrogance, hubris, and also, you know, we are one of the stakeholders. If you look at where the money is in the economy, you know, a disproportionate amount comes into the healthcare system. And so repurposing that, as Ian says, that's somebody's salary, and it will be fought by the people by the incumbents. It's natural. So it's a very tricky problem. Ian.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on that, you know, Mark and I are both advisors to Levitt Partners, and Governor Mike Levitt, I think, has been quite eloquent about the social determinants, even being a big fan, but saying that it's unlikely that health systems per se can take that responsibility on their balance sheets. They're just not big enough, right? And what frightens me is that the logical people to do are state and local governments. And I come back to what I think is the undertold story of this economic malaise associated with COVID, which is, you know, all that state revenue gone, and the very places who should really be stepping up to do something about social determinants are going to be the locus of government without the resources to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of frightening. I do think health systems, and I'm proud to be associated with MLK, because we certainly preach a message of social determinants, even to the point of having our farmers market every Wednesday, where it looks like the 9th arrondissement in front of MLK. And I was sort of gallows humor saying that, you know, we're giving the community fresh arugula, but what they really need is free insulin, right? I mean, our number one admission at MLK is for untreated diabetes and you know, for 20 years because they couldn't see a doctor. And our number one surgical admission is for amputations associated with septic conditions. So I think we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, the institutions and the parts of the country that are least well served are ones that are going to be hurt for a whole bunch of reasons in the aftermath of all of this. So God bless you all that we can turn the narrative around. I'm with Abram. Let's get a new story.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. So last couple of minutes, I'd love to just give you all a chance to make any final comments, things that either you want to amplify or that we haven't had a chance to touch on.
So I'll go. So Bob, one of the things that I just felt so privileged to oversee is an organization at Gates Foundation that had the saying, all lives have equal value. And just listening to this discussion and the whole question about social determinants, for me, I'd love, like Abraham, to feel optimistic about this, you know, first half of 2020 as a moment where the country decided that all Americans have equal value. And that means that you think of health as an investment, that you think of education as an investment, and that you think of skills as an employee as an investment. The World Bank had this big thing a couple of years ago of talk about human capital, which is a real technocratic word and not that inspiring. But for me, thinking about how we invest in the citizens of America and how they have access to healthcare and education and a job, I think we have to go back to basics. I really think it's that, and I think it takes leadership, and it moves from, especially in tough times, from an expense to an investment.
Great, thank you. Ian, you want to weigh in on sort of things that you think we should amplify, or you just want to end with?
Well, I want to end with a thank you to you, Bob. I got to tell you, I've been in my pajamas retweeting you for like 3 months. It's the only thing that's kept me sane. But seriously, you know, we're dear friends. But I think what you've done and what UCSF and Stanford, for that matter, have done in terms of radical acts of transparency have kept, particularly as lay people who don't understand medicine as well as you all do. It's been a gift, and I think one of the great acts of public service throughout this thing. So thank you.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. I was wondering whether I was one of those crazy tweeters that Sue was getting at. So I guess.
No.
Mark, anything you want to add?
So, ditto to the thanks. I mean, I tune in also for, you know, state-of-the-art information on testing and vaccines and the rest of it and treatment. And I just thank you for opening this one little forum up to talk about these larger issues, because I think all of us who go to work in wherever we're going to work, professionals and lay people, are struggling with trying to make sense of both of these big things that are happening. And so I thank you for giving us the opportunity to maybe speak what's on our minds and help people try to give language to what all these unprecedented things we're dealing with. So keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say it's, you know, I'm incredibly proud of the organization, and it's, you know, this is a stress test. It's a leadership stress test. It's a stress test of the people, and people have responded extraordinarily well. But in some ways, COVID is easier because it's science and it's medicine and it's math, and we kind of get it. And as we get into the racial issues and the cultural issues, and, you know, I just speaking for myself, there are absolutely times where I feel like I'm a good person. I have no idea what the hell to do. You know, what is the right thing to do that will advance the cause and not offend someone and all that. Do you have any guidance about that, Mark, before we move on?
We're out of time. Maybe we'll do that next.
It's a hard one. It's a hard one.
He's
Abraham,
hard.
I guess give you the last word. And in some ways, this would be a great book for someone to write of the last 3 or 4 months, and maybe you're already doing that. But, you know, sort of what is the narrative here, and how do we move forward?
Well, I'm not sure that we've written the ending yet, Bob, but I would just say that we're all isolated, and yet we don't have solitude. You know, we're just being bombarded by so many things, so many messages, Zoom. And I'd just like to invite, especially your residents and medical students, I think are the real folks who are going to solve this all for us one day, if we don't manage to do it, to embrace that solitude, to really reflect, you know, without noise coming at them, on what has happened the last couple of days. And I'd like us all to resolve to take one action to try and, you know, breach this divide that has become so apparent.
Great.
You know, Bob, I recognize I do have one suggestion. Trevor
please.
Noah had an 18-minute YouTube where he talked about the dominoes that have happened in the last 2 weeks that I found helpful, and others might find helpful when struggling with the question, gee, there's one guy gets killed, it's terrible, but how has that ignited this conflagration around the world? And the answer is, it's not one guy. But I think I recommend that to you. You can find it on YouTube. I think people may find it helpful to step in somebody else's shoes and try to understand, which is probably the first answer to your question of what do I do, is first try to understand.
Great. Well, I couldn't be more grateful to all of you. You are all dear friends and remarkable people, and you've lived up to my incredibly high hopes for you to I don't know if we solved things, but I think we've moved the ball down the field and helped, I think, me and I'm sure others understand it better and put it in context. And you're all extraordinarily wonderful and wise, and very nice of you to do that. So thank you all. Be well, be safe, stay sane. To our listeners and viewers, we will put this on YouTube probably about 7 o'clock tonight. I will tweet it out, and hope people get something out of it as I did. I'll be back to you next Thursday, probably with something a little more traditional, back into looking at some of the key issues in COVID. You see here the members of our production team who pull this thing off flawlessly every week, which is not that easy. And thanks to all of them. So be well and stay safe, and we'll see you again next Thursday. Thanks so much.